Welcome to the Retail Focus Podcast, a weekly collection of news, interviews, and information from the world of retail. Here are your hosts, Trent Kling and Leighton Kling.
Welcome to this edition of the Retail Focus Podcast. I'm Trent Kling. He's Leighton Kling. Coming up on today's show, a lot going on in the retail world this week. We don't even get a chance to talk about Best Buy and their positive earnings call despite some potential tumult in their C-suite. We will talk about Home Depot, Lumber Liquidators, and of course, Amazon Go Grocery, as we are so obligated to do. Our interview guest is Alex Barsayan. He's the former head of retail with Blackhawk Network, which is the largest retail gift card solutions provider in the U.S. We've had representatives from Blackhawk on in the past, just on a periodic basis, checking in on the state of the gift card industry. However, you'll find with our conversation with him, a lot has changed in the past couple of years, and there's a lot of great developments to not only keep your eye on in a retail sense, but a lot that could be benefiting retail stores as well. A reminder that you can like us and rate us however you access us. If you enjoy the podcast, want to help others find it, the ratings really do help, whether that's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other listening medium. Additionally, you can check us out at Retail Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. We lead the show with Home Depot earnings. They posted a beat and saw positive share price movement after the call on Tuesday morning. This was despite markets decreasing nearly 5% on Monday and Tuesday of this week against those coronavirus fears. Of course, dropped off even more later in the week before kind of leveling off a little bit in trading on Friday. But it's still notable that Home Depot was able to actually pop a little bit after that earnings call. Most of the benefit was lost later in the week with the overall market sell-off. And it's interesting because coronavirus actually didn't come up on the Home Depot call in the prepared remarks like they did for other retailers, the likes of Best Buy and Lumber Liquidators, who we'll talk about later on. But in the analyst Q&A, leadership actually said that based on what they knew at the time of the call, there wouldn't be an impact for coronavirus for Home Depot's operations. Still, you saw the share price fall towards the end of the week. As far as this earnings call is concerned, though, Leighton, analysts expected adjusted earnings per share of $2.11 after the company tallied adjusted earnings per share of $2.25 for the same quarter a year ago, and they were able to beat those expectations.
And with that, we go to the call. We see that the U.S.-based stores are seeing positive comps increasing about 5.3%. And you see overall brick and mortar was positive, with e-commerce even more so. E-commerce continued to comp positive by around the same amount that it had the rest of the year, 20.8% for the fourth quarter. So up almost 21% for the e-commerce growth there at Home Depot. The comp sales increase was a major factor behind net earnings increasing by 19 cents over last year. The positive news led to management and their board of directors electing a 10% dividend increase. Their quarterly dividend now sits at $1.50 per share. That should make those institutional investors quite happy. However, just as important on the call was management's release of expectations for fiscal 2020. After showing comp sales growth of 3.8% during the entirety of 2019, this, of course, helped by the fourth quarter, they feel as though that the growth will be backed up in 2020. Indeed, they see comp sales growth coming in between 3.5% to 4% during 2020 overall. Total sales growth is expected to move in lockstep with the comp sales growth numbers as they anticipate the opening of only 6 new stores through the course of the year. By the way, mentioning new stores and how many stores they currently have 2,291 stores chain-wide. They anticipate operating margin to continue to be one of the best in all of retail at approximately 14%. And this really speaks to sort of our faith in this company, that they are really motivated to continue to execute. And this really shows with this particular number. Operating margin for a retailer that is as mature as Home Depot being this high really speaks to their operating mechanisms. As a result of all of this, they expect slight earnings per share growth of around 2% for the coming year. You look at the remarks that were made on this particular quarterly earnings call. Generally, their CEO, Craig Menear, was very excited about their execution in the fourth quarter. Although their fourth quarter results were better than expected, you can see this just by working backward from their full year expectation updates after the third quarter. Menear seemed much more excited than usual about some of the most recent strategic initiatives that they've laid out. One of the things he mentioned was that growth in the fourth quarter was very evenly spread throughout the company. And that is always good, Trent, because when you see a company that is this large, I said this mature, you can see that they have multiple regions that operate, and to have them all see positive growth is a great thing for the company.
It is indeed, and in fact, all of their 19 regions in the U.S. comped positive for the quarter, which is, again, so rare for this large of a retailer. Sometimes you'll see softness in one part of the country or another, especially when your sales are slightly weather dependent, as Home Depot's are. Canada and Mexico, of course, also comping positive, which is a solid sign there. The comp growth, Menear said, was as a result of both ticket and transaction growth. Again, a great sign in the home improvement space, as it indicates they're seeing both momentum for the DIY consumer and contractors, also known as their pro customers on the call. However, ticket size is increasing at a faster rate than traffic, 4.4% to just 0.8% for traffic. The ticket size was helped along by transactions over $1,000. Those now represent around 20% of Home Depot's overall transactions. Those transactions, by the way, those are up double digits year over year in terms of the number of transactions and also the amount they're getting per transactions. This speaks to, again, improvements in their pro customer space, but also a little bit of that freed up spending from the DIY customer that is going to purchase those bigger ticket items when they have that discretionary spending. One of the Q&A questions coming in from analysts on the call was actually about the fact that traffic hasn't grown all that much. And the question was, do you anticipate just 1% traffic growth being the new normal? And Menear said, really, they're looking to reverse that trend. They're making investments in the coming quarter, hoping to boost traffic. But he said it's always a balance. They've done such a great job at growing ticket size. And part of that is because of their marketing. Part of that is because of their merchandising. Now they're looking to balance that back out a little bit. But he said they're not super disappointed with the traffic only growing 1% because their ticket size is growing. Helping to drive comp growth in this last quarter, among those numbers, not only the amount per transaction, but also traffic, were multiple categories. We'll talk about those in a second, but also multiple events. Their Black Friday sales set records for the company, as did their Cyber Week sales. That's not super unusual. We're seeing a lot of retailers set their Cyber Week records in the fourth quarter of 2019. The suggestion overall on the call, though, was that consumer demand is in a very good spot. And when you look at comps broken down by category, they came in above company average in kitchen and bath, which are notable for those big ticket items, but also exterior paint. And if you break that down a little bit, when you look at exterior paint, that again signifying a little bit more discretionary income. Usually painting the outside of your house is one of the last things that you do, and it's one of the last things that you focus on. Also, it's something that you're seeing a lot of contractors pick up work on because, again, it comes back to that discretionary income. People have more of it. The other thing it comes down to is the housing market, because oftentimes houses will get a fresh coat of exterior paint before they go on the market. So it might be speaking to some momentum there. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as it pertains to lumber liquidators later on in the show. Home Depot, as far as they're concerned, they're seeing increased momentum in window coverings as well. That's a segment that they are just now beginning to mature in. They haven't always been known as the window covering store, but they're working their way into that category. And we've talked in the past about their HD home category, some more soft lines there that they're working to develop on their e-commerce site. It's a digital-only proposition right now for them. They saw significant growth in this area as well, not just growth in line with the rest of e-commerce, but growth outpacing the rest of e-commerce. Kind of makes one wonder if a time will come in the future to maybe transition that segment to brick and mortar.
Menear continued to make reference to increased investment in their refresh of front end. We're going to talk a lot about refreshes here in this segment, but including more streamlined buy online pickup and store pickup areas and advanced self-checkouts more befitting Home Depot's merchandising mix. And I think this is something that has really needed to be a focus for them long term. I think both Lowe's and Home Depot could do a few things to make the front end of the store a little bit better, a little bit more seamless for those customers, especially those customers that just want in and out. We talked about the contracting business all the time, but they have to focus all of their attention on the entirety of their customer base. And to that point, he mentioned their increase in e-commerce sales, which they feel is being driven more by store lockers and streamlined front end that I just mentioned. In fact, he noted that over 50% of e-commerce orders are actually picked up in store, astounding, allowing for that crossover traffic that is so important to pick up impulse buys and upsells. And no, we're not talking just about chewing gum. They're doing a lot of branded things on the end caps of their front ends. And I think that is really helping those impulse buys. They still want to expand their e-commerce presence beyond buy online, pick up in store, going live with a facility to assist with product delivery, which they feel could be a major sales driver for those pro contracting customers in the future. And it's interesting because Menear said on the call that even after using third party for customer deliveries, they are searching for control over the process, control over branding, control over quality, and control over the customer experience as a whole. Thus, the reason why they continue to search for effective ways to deliver in-house. And I think that is an excellent way to look at things, Trent, because you want to have a firm grasp on the entirety of that experience. Because if you're a customer with Home Depot, you have to know that things are going to be streamlined and similar every time you make a purchase, every time you procure a certain item, especially if you're a pro customer that needs something delivered to a particular site that's maybe different than historically. Working with different vendors can often be headaches, and I think that is why they want to take control over this in order to really give the expectation that things are going to be delivered when they say they are going to be delivered. It sounds simple, but it's actually really, really hard in execution, and you also have to be aware that as things kind of wind down in this particular space and become much more competitive with the delivery landscape in general, that margins are going to be a focus, and if a company can do something in-house more effectively and increase that margin ever so slightly, they should be going that route. Executive Vice President of Merchandising Ted Decker spoke of advertising and marketing spend, and while it hasn't changed much from previous years, they are using a bit of a different approach here. Decker credited a new tagline, "How Doers Get More Done," and a digitally focused ad campaign with one of the largest single days of download numbers for the app. Additionally, they are seeing digital tool interaction, including their app, up around double digits from a year ago, especially in the product locator and image search functions, which I've used recently, Trent. Very, very good. Image search, by the way, allows customers to snap a picture of a part or product as a means of locating that product in Home Depot's digital platform. This is something Jeff Hunt referenced in the interview last week, but it is something that has proved helpful for Home Depot. And when it works, both pro customers and do-it-yourself customers, those individuals like Trent and I, can actually use it to a great degree. And Trent, I know you've actually used it to find a plumbing part recently that was actually not that common, and it worked exceptionally well. If you have not seen or heard ads from the recent ad campaign, their app and digital services are at the forefront of this. It will be interesting to see how they work their digital channels, all of their different channels, into their traditional springtime garden-focused ads as we move into March. And Trent, speaking of spring, that is a huge time for hiring for these kinds of retail companies. A lot of retailers are looking to hire a lot of employees for this springtime push. It's very important to a lot of retailers, not just Home Depot and Lowe's, but also Walmart. But Home Depot, especially as of late with the most recent news, Trent.
As far as Home Depot is concerned, this call came right after a press release that they were seeking to hire 80,000 employees for spring, most part-time in the garden center. This was mentioned once again on the call. Now, this number certainly seems high, but you always wonder how it compares to prior years. And in Home Depot's case, it's directly in line with what the company aimed to hire in 2019 for the spring season. Even still, this represents a bit of a different approach than the one we've seen from Lowe's of late, where the number of employees per store has been reduced somewhat. And when we're talking about Lowe's said at the beginning of January, actually, it was looking to hire 53,000 workers, so not quite as many as Home Depot. And we don't really have specifics on Lowe's spring hiring plans for this year other than those particular numbers and maybe some events that they have coming up. That said, as far as the spring season, as far as the garden center is concerned overall, Home Depot does have some initiatives they're working on for such a huge season in the home improvement space. And you're talking about a space where with the garden center, if you execute it right, that can be high margin. If you execute it poorly, you can lose a lot of money there in terms of shrink. But outside of just the plants and the mulch and the soil that you think about when you're talking about garden centers, one of the main focuses on this call was Home Depot's attempted reset in the outdoor power tool space. Rather than displaying their assortment by product as you would have had before, maybe you have electric hedge trimmers or battery-operated hedge trimmers all in one section. And that's pretty typical with most of retail. You think you go to a store, you look at, say, candy bars, and you have all the candy bars just in one display, rather being displayed by brand. But that's where Home Depot is going. They said that after analysis, they feel like it's going to be more beneficial for them to display their assortment by brand, which is something they have been doing with their indoor power tools selection, the likes of drills and circular saws. So when you go to a Home Depot garden center this year, and you look at some of the outdoor power tools, all the Milwaukee power tools will be in one area, Ryobi in another area, and so forth. And the reason they're doing this, they feel as though this is going to not only work with the refresh of indoor power tools, especially given the brand-related cordless systems that have become a greater proposition for customers recently, but they're looking to underscore the value to consumers. They're looking to tell the consumer that, hey, if you buy this electric outdoor equipment or battery operated outdoor equipment and you buy another piece from the same brand, you have these interchangeable battery systems that are going to save you money in the long term. So leadership is calling it really a value proposition to present products to customers in this way, as they can potentially visualize savings on the things like batteries, for example, when shopping within one brand vertical. A really interesting approach here for Home Depot, and you wonder if, obviously, power tools are kind of their own separate category, and because you have the battery packs there, they kind of present themselves in a unique fashion, but you wonder if Home Depot is going to find it pertinent to do this with some of their other products across some of their other areas. Again, we'll find out, but I'm anxious really to see how this refresh of their merchandising in the garden center pays off for them come the next month or two as the weather warms in most of the country. Well, that'll do it for the first news segment of the podcast. Coming up after this break, we'll be joined by Alex Barsayan. He's the former head of retail with Blackhawk Network. He's going to give us an update on the gift card industry in the U.S. as it pertains to retail currently. But not only is he going to give us that update, he's also going to fill us in on some of the new technologies and some of the new things to keep an eye on as far as gift cards in retail for 2020 and beyond. Every few years, we like to touch on the wide and varied landscape of gift cards, particularly as it pertains to brick and mortar retail. And who'd better to discuss the subject and the current state of gift cards in retail stores than Alex Barsayan. He's the former head of retail for Blackhawk Network, the largest gift card solutions provider in the U.S. He's also the author of Local Motion, How Technology is Personalizing the Global Marketplace. Alex, welcome to the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Trent.
So we'll start off with the most general of questions possible here. What is the current state of gift cards as they exist in retail stores and on e-commerce sites?
Yeah, it couldn't be any better. Like when I look at external studies, one of them is through the National Retail Federation, NRF. I always get worried about it, but every year they ask to see what is the most wanted gift for the holidays, and for 12 years in a row, they've said gift cards is the number one most preferred gift. The other thing, too, is with gift cards, it's still growing. Although we might feel it's a saturated market, it's still outpacing physical retail sales considerably. So it's really good product to give in the market. Like one interesting stat I might give you is that last year overall, digital e-commerce sales were up by 12% from the year before, which is significant when you think about a market that is growing, fairly saturated, but digital is really prevalent in its growth path. And physical grew by 7%. So that to me is a product that's fairly mature, but still growing because the demand for a ubiquitous type of gift is still in need.
And let's talk now about the holiday season aspect of things here. We just wrapped up a very busy holiday season. What were the spending trends surrounding gift cards based on the data we've seen so far?
Yeah, I have to be honest. There was a lot of worry because there was headwinds going into the holiday. So, forget about the political issues of tariffs on China, which sometimes dampens consumer purchasing behavior. We have seen, it's been many years, we've seen such a short holiday purchasing period. So between Black Friday and Christmas, it was a lot fewer days than before. So we were actually really worried that we wouldn't grow as much as we've done in the past. So again, one of our benchmarks is how we compare to, we sell in Kroger and Albertsons and Target, in Home Depot. And so that's a barometer of how they're growing as aggregate. And they grew about 5.1%, which is still good when you think about the overall landscape. We grew in the same markets more than 7%. So when we think about what that means is people coming out of holiday, and this is the important thing to remember, is that gift cards are given as gifts, but roughly 80% of the people who get a gift, whether it's physical or digital, want to spend that in the first few months of the year. So when you think about January and February as being, kind of doldrums of retail, consumers kind of retracting spend, it is kind of a floodgate for consumers to go back into the stores. And typically we see another $30 loaded on a card that we normally didn't see before. So it's a really good way for retailers to play the game. Holidays performed better than we thought, outpacing regular retail. But more importantly, it gives a cachet for the January, February, March period for a reason for customers to go back into the stores to purchase products.
Now, all that being said, we've talked about how things are fairly robust in the gift card space currently. What has changed or how much has changed over the last 2 to 3 years as far as the merchandising of gift cards is concerned to help kind of drive that growth?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. So when you think about verticals, and this is a little bit of gift card speak, but when you think about the Visa, MasterCard, they call that open loop cards. And you think about cards that are for specific brands, like a Starbucks card or an iTunes card. There is a creation of a new category we call multi-category cards, or our brand is called Happy Cards. And this gives the ability to a customer to almost act like an open loop card, but also use it as a specific retailer. So you pick the theme. So let's say it's a happy birthday card or happy holidays card. On there's 5 or 6 different merchants that you can use that card at. That has been able to solve a lot of problems. One being customers want choice. Customers want something a little more personalized. And customers want to give something a little more meaningful. We've seen this product, I can't share the specific stats, but it is absolutely blown up to be a few $100 million business in 18 months. So for us, when we think about product vertical expansion, we've only touched the tip of the iceberg when it comes to new products and categories than just the typical Visa, MasterCard, or the specific branded gift cards out in the marketplace.
And that's an interesting concept there because, again, you're introducing something where it's not necessarily an open card like a Visa, MasterCard, Amex. It's not a one retailer card. It's a multi-retailer card. It can be a little bit more flexible. What's the communication like to consumers, to people that might be in the market to buy those cards, to kind of educate them that this product not only exists but can solve a number of gifting solutions for them?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. So when we think about a product that you launch, you can't just put it on the shelves and expect for a customer to understand it. If you've gone to a Kroger and Target, you've seen this giant wall of gift cards. It's, 400 different facings or different products on the shelves. And how do you get the customer to focus in on that? So we've done a lot of communications and PR activity around it. So Ellen DeGeneres has talked about our product numerous times. We've showcased this product within our communications. Our partners send out emails or flyers, web page postings, really talking about giving the gift of choice without an activation fee. When you think about buying a Visa or MasterCard, it gives you the choice, but then you got to pay a loading fee, so it avoids that. And if you're already going to buy a Starbucks card when you walk into the store, we're not trying to convert those customers. We're trying to get the customers who come into a store thinking they want something for their uncle or uncle's birthday or something, but they don't know exactly what they want. So in this way, the Happy Card that's who we really try to focus on, is that customer who isn't sure what they want, want choice, is sensitive to the activation fees. And so that's our key message that we've been kind of bombarding to a certain extent, right? Not overly bombarding, but bombarding customers who walk into stores to buy a gift card, to educate them. We've done some cool things, advertising within Times Square, but you don't know what the impact of that is. So take a lot of things, awareness outside of the marketplace, but also a lot spent in store when you're actually in the channels to communicate a new product.
Now, retailers are basically constantly trying to tweak the way they approach this category, and it's a growing category, so it's attracting a lot of attention from retailers. What are some things over the next 2-3 years or so that retailers should keep in mind as far as this industry is concerned as they continue to tweak their approaches?
So as a retailer, there is going to be an ever-increasing amount of focus on local. Obviously, my book is about local motion, but it is the reason why I say that is because, as you know, as a consumer, 9 out of 10 times when you're going to go out to eat, you don't go to a chain restaurant. You're going to go to the local establishment. Either you heard about it, word of mouth. So there is going to be a real strong approach to monetizing what it means to be local in retail. So that's number one. Number two, I would say, is it's not just going to be about physical gift cards in store. Be ready for the store of the future in which you can walk to a screen and, put in the gift card that you want. At the end of the day, retailers have a restriction on space. Digital screens, kiosks, QR codes allow them to showcase even more inventory that they normally wouldn't get access to. The third is, my goodness, I would say as a retailer in the gift card category, really focus on gaming. Gaming is going through a huge explosion that if you're not a gamer, you might hear about it from your son or nephew, but oh yeah, gaming is popular. More people watched the Clash of Clans final game, like an esport, than they watched the Super Bowl. So there is going to be more of an emphasis on gaming in store. When Fortnite releases a new skin, how can I get that in store? So as a retailer, really pay attention, close attention to what's going on in the gaming world, because it's an attractive audience base. It's not about selling advertisements like they do in the Super Bowl. It's about engaging members in a passion play. So be mindful of how you can grab them and create content that's around esports, the publishers coming out with new games, how to engage customers. So I think those three things, that if retailers really pay attention to that, they'll be part of the next growth path of gift cards.
I wanted to follow up on that gaming path a little bit because it's interesting, something that we don't talk often about, but from a merchandiser's perspective or from a solutions perspective, that is an industry where you see a lot of ups and downs. You see hot and cold very quickly. As you mentioned, new skins, that type of thing being released. How difficult is it from a merchandiser's perspective to keep things fresh and make sure that they are on top of all the relevant trends?
You're getting all the right questions here. I talked about digital screens. So when you think about digital screens, somebody can walk into a store. You can actually change the screen to showcase whatever you want. I'm not just talking about changing a promotion on the fly. You don't have to, send in a bunch of merchandisers to change it, 2 times fuel points to 4 times. You can actually do that on the screen. But you can now actually showcase Call of Duty or Doom is coming out April 15th. You can actually have a call to action right on the screen, and using your finger, you can actually make that purchase. So I think these digital screens or this interactive merchandising display is really going to accelerate. The timing couldn't be any better of those two coming to fruition at the same time. That being said, not everybody can afford to invest in digital screens. So it might behoove somebody. So if you go to a Meijer right now, you'll see within their gaming section, they devote a lot of attention to the gaming category. They've actually separated them out. So when you go to the gaming section, you'll have a wall of Fortnite cash, Xbox passes, and a whole slew of content there. And for them, what they've done is they've kind of separated out the regular gift card program that doesn't need to be merchandised as often. So, a Darden is a Darden, AMC is an AMC, but then things that revolve a lot more quickly, you can actually park that out, incubate it, and then have a section that you can merchandise more because it's less work effort. So if you have space in a store and you want to grab a hold of the gaming category, I would think about, can I carve it out a separate section? Can I send in specific, corrugated cardboard boxes that just have new game titles, being shipped up, just kind of like we see, old school DVDs still when there's a new release of a DVD, freestanding display of DVDs of Toy Story 4. I would challenge retail to think about it the same way.
I want to shift gears from brick and mortar back into the e-commerce space. And one of the things I wanted to touch on, it's an interesting data point from Blackhawk that customers are increasingly buying gift cards for themselves. They're not just buying gift cards as gifts. How does this change a retailer's approach to marketing and executing on the gift card front? I suppose e-commerce certainly, but also brick and mortar as well.
Yeah, so there is two sides of this world of gift cards. One is I buy it as a gift. The physical gift card, you want to wrap it up and give it something tangible. And there is actually the much bigger pie, which is self-use. So I buy it for myself because I want to save money, or I want to load my cupboard with specific items that I know I'm going to use at a future time. So promotions that drive face value discounts, but more importantly, points-based behavior. So, Giant Eagle's Fuel Perks program or Kroger's Fuel program are great examples of these retailers incentivizing customers through points and loyalty to say, instead of going somewhere else, buy it here. I'm going to give you extra cash in the form of Fuel Perks, their currency. And so if you are a person who is a contractor who does renovations and you live within a store, whether it's in Cleveland or Pittsburgh where there's a Giant Eagle, you get incented because there is a Home Depot 4 times fuel points. You're going to go and buy those Home Depot cards because you're now going to get up, essentially buy $500 of Home Depot cards and get almost a free tank of gas. That's a great incentive for a person to buy gift cards for self-use because you're also getting rewarded yourself. I would, again, challenge retailers to think about, it's not just about promotions. Because we know discounting a gift card face value is always going to work. But the more sustainable model is, how do they work within your own ecosystem, not just to drive face value discounts? How can you use them to leverage other services and products to get them more engaged within your retail ecosystem? I think that is the smarter approach to retail and how to, you're never going to escape the self-use discount market, but how can you shift them over to not just to buy at a discount, but then to buy and to get rewarded for coming to your store?
I want to finish up with the $1 million question, if you will. Well, really, given the size of the industry, it's more like a $1 billion question. But we've talked a lot about the various technologies at play. We've talked about touchscreens and kiosks and a lot of the new things coming into this space. But if you could pick one thing, what is the technology you feel like is going to transform this space over the next 5 years?
Transit. If I had a crystal ball, I was a betting man, maybe not $1 billion, but if I had a little bit of cash, what I would do is I would bet on, sounds really cheesy, but the mobile apps will change the way customers interact with the store. They're already doing that to a certain extent, but I'm not talking about Apple Pay. I'm talking about customers now finding it worthwhile to download a Target Circle app, which if you've seen the numbers, it's, they launched this thing 6-7 months ago and the numbers of downloads are staggering. I can see Kroger doing the same thing and Giant Eagle doing the same thing, but it's got to be meaningful. I believe that in itself will transform the gift card category, because what that will do is allow customers to engage and buy something at any given time, whether it's getting points, getting cash off. You can get it shipped physically if you prefer. But the convenience factor, I believe, is going to be key. And I'm not saying convenience that it's all digital, because every time somebody thinks, oh, it's got a mobile app, it needs a digital Starbucks card to my wallet, which is obviously completely seamless. But what's going to happen is that it's going to be completely objective. If I want a physical card mailed to me or an employee who's done a great job at work, I can actually be able to do that with this app. So to me, the future is having these retailers really garner the full spectrum of the ecosystem of the customers to be able to get them to use it, not just to load up your Netflix account, but also cash out on Uber on your app. So if you're a driver in Uber, you can actually use that as a way to, get cash out, which would run on the gift card currency. You can top up or pay your Disney Plus subscription fee. Maybe you don't want to pay a 12-month subscription fee all in one shot because you want to watch your show, then jump to Netflix. So why not use a gift card as a form of payment so you can subscribe for 2 months or 3-month bursts, all using your app? Or how about you using the app to get engaged in their favorite game. So I really feel that if somebody really wanted to open up a world of gift cards 5 years out, and beyond just looking at gift cards, but looking at it as a form of payment type, because it is a payment type, that if it sits within an app, makes it seamless, you're agnostic whether it's physical or digital, but allow it to be the real center of payments within that ecosystem, that's when somebody's going to unleash $1 billion business to, a few $100 billion business, because now you're tapping into self-use, convenience, physical or digital, top up. So that's where I think it's going to be headed. I mean, it's a 5-year out question. It's not exactly perfect, but, if I had a crystal ball, Trent, that's where I would kind of point to.
We won't hold it against you if that doesn't all come to fruition exactly that way in 5 years, though. But we certainly do appreciate you joining us on the podcast once again. Alex Barsayan, former head of retail for Blackhawk Network and author of Local Motion, How Technology is Personalizing the Global Marketplace. Thanks so much for taking the time today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
We thank Alex for joining us once again on the podcast, and I highly recommend checking out his book as well. It's a great read, and you can find that just about any online retail outlet if you were so inclined, including the one that shares its name with a rainforest in South America. Speaking of that particular website, we feel like we're obligated to cover some news regarding Amazon this week.
Yeah, and the news that we typically feel obligated to cover, I mean, it is one of the biggest retail presences, certainly by media clicks, but Amazon Go introduced their first full-line grocery store this week. So we did feel like it was necessary to mention this on this edition of the podcast. We're sorry that this is probably a redundant story for everyone out there who's interested in this space, but we wanted to attempt to take a look. It's called, simply enough, Amazon Go Grocery. You look at the details of this particular store opening. The store is around 10,400 square feet in size and is located in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood. We should note that most neighborhoods in Seattle have a higher median household income than the rest of the country. And that's pretty logical if you think about those immediate areas, because they house senior executives at companies like Amazon and Microsoft, and so are to expect a higher median household income. But this is especially true of this Capitol Hill neighborhood where you are seeing this brand new launch. This store is about 5 times larger than the typical Amazon Go stores that have now been around for about a few years now. And Trent, when we first reported on those new iterations of Amazon Go stores a couple, 2-3 years ago on this edition of the podcast, we'll notice that they're around 2,000 to 3,000 square feet in size. So that is about right. About 5 times larger is this new grocery format. And this new store uses sensors to detect which products are selected off the shelves by which customers. The natural result is that customers can walk out of the store without stopping at the front end to check out. So they don't have to see a cashier. They don't even have to go through a self-checkout line wherein they scan their own items. They are simply charged through their Amazon account. That said, customers are required to have an Amazon account, obviously, to enter the store. And in order to enable that, there are automated gates at the front of the store that prohibit entry to those that do not have an account and those that have not enabled the feature on their Amazon Go app to enter. Now, there is some argument regarding the margin at these stores, Trent. Bezos, after a 2017 story about a potential Amazon Go grocery launch in the New York Post, was critical of the story's claim that the store would aim for around 20% margins. However, Britton Ladd, a former Amazon executive and supply chain consultant now, said in a story with Fox News this week that it may actually be possible for the store to gain double-digit margins. If so, those would be the most robust margins recorded by Amazon's retail divisions. And as far as some of the reported margins at Whole Foods, much better than those as well. So still, we wonder if this is really the best case scenario given the likely necessary maintenance and constant refurbishing and refreshing of the robotics and sensors used inside the store. And this is, Trent, often a criticism that we hone in on when talking about these types of stores that don't require cashiers, is that how much does it cost for that constant maintenance of that new technology? And how often, just like with Amazon server farms, are you going to have to be switching that hardware out?
But we still have some questions about this. Now, it appears as though, for the most part, the launch, and give Amazon certainly credit for this, has gone pretty smoothly. There's even some stories online about news outlets trying to shoplift from the store, basically trying to walk out with merchandise from the store without maybe paying for it or something along those lines. So again, the launch seems to be working fairly well. There's no reports of some technological issues as there was the first time with the smaller Amazon Go stores. But we do have some questions going forward. The main one, as is always the case with any of Amazon's brick and mortar endeavors, is can they scale to the extent where they would be actually competitive with longtime grocers and Walmart? Well, to put it in perspective, back in 2018, we discussed how Amazon's media leaks suggested the company had plans for as many as 3,000 cashierless stores by 2021. This was after initial articles in 2017 suggesting that this technology was right around the corner for Amazon. At the time, we even talked about it on the show. We thought, that's a lot of stores, and that's a lot of real estate necessary. And the concept at that point hadn't even been proven out. Today, they have 25, exactly 25 cashierless stores. So unless they plan on opening 2,975 stores in the next 18 months or so, this speculation is going to be proven essentially baseless. And for anyone that's ever attempted to work a real estate deal on behalf of a business, it's a time-consuming process. So Amazon's basically got to hire a ton of new staff just to get leases done on those 2,975 stores, in theory. That would be a virtual impossibility to do in the next 18 months. And, you know, if you've listened to the podcast for any length of time, we talk to a lot of people about the real estate landscape on the show. We haven't heard any rumors from them or any of the people that we've talked to about these massive lease signings or acquisitions for Amazon. But the one thing we should always keep in mind is this: Amazon's PR machine is fantastic at their job and relentless. They probably have the best PR in retail as far as drawing attention to them and getting free media attention. And shoot, it's worked. We're talking about it. Other media outlets talk about it. Media attention alone from this Amazon Go grocery store would be enough to excuse the store from serving as a loss leader, even if they didn't hit those double-digit margins that were talked about by Leighton. We've become so accustomed at this point to well-timed media leaks of pie-in-the-sky Amazon plans, the vast majority of which haven't yet panned out, at least. Remember all the media attention they got in 2016 and 2017 regarding drone delivery? Yeah, we're kind of still waiting on that. But more than anything, we feel this store will serve as a benefit for Amazon on the PR front, even if they cannot compete with grocers on price or scale nationally. And speaking of price, there are some stories out there, including an article on GeekWire, where they compared the price of Amazon's Go grocery store in that Capitol Hill district of Seattle to a nearby QFC. QFC is a Kroger-owned grocer in that area, perhaps not as popular as the larger Fred Meyer stores, but still Kroger-owned. And they actually found Amazon Go grocery to be a little bit cheaper. So the groceries that they got in this particular store, $52.78 was the total there. The similar groceries at the QFC, $55.70. One big caveat to that, because you can say like, oh, look, Amazon's already undercutting Kroger, all of this stuff. Well, guess what? Amazon Go Grocery, the items that were purchased there was exactly one generic product from Amazon. Most of the products included in the story have generic or store brand analogs. For example, the organic milk that they purchased at Amazon Go Grocery, that was a name brand organic milk. If they were to have purchased the generic or store brand organic product at QFC, or the Simple Truth organic product, as Kroger calls them, it would have saved a significant amount of money, by my count at least $1.50. The same thing goes with something like Kellogg's Frosted Flakes, whereas Amazon Go Grocery, you don't have the opportunity for that store brand. You can go to the QFC and find that Kroger store brand and, again, save some money there. So I think while you can argue that, hey, you can save money at Amazon Go if you buy only name brand products, for most consumers, that's not likely. And I think that is something to keep in mind as far as Amazon's competition on this Amazon Go grocery front. And there are definite shortcomings to this model. And I apologize, I'm going to go on a little bit of not necessarily a rant, but just a little bit of a tangent here. When you look at this Amazon Go grocery store, again, as Leighton mentioned, the Capitol Hill district is a district where you honestly might not have to compete on price because it is such a wealthy district in comparison to others throughout the country. How would this fare in areas that are less urban, especially those that require actually driving to the store? The Capitol Hill district is very walkable in Seattle. As we're beginning to find, grocery customers seem to be telling stores that front end, in this case, the cashier, is not the friction point with grocers. It is the time it takes to actually shop and then the inconvenience of driving to the store, neither one of which this store actually addresses. This really just kind of removes the front end friction if there is. But most grocers have addressed any perceived front end friction points through their own platforms. If you've ever used Kroger's Scan and Go, for example, there's not a whole lot that Amazon Go grocery addresses that Scan and Go doesn't, and you can't argue. I mean, I guess you could, but it wouldn't be necessarily the best argument that the whole process of actually having to scan the product is going to put you out to the point where you go to Amazon Go instead of your typical grocer, especially when, something that the article on GeekWire didn't mention, QFC, Kroger is offering fuel points through their program. So there are benefits externally to shopping at QFC as well. Which brings us to kind of our final question. Does this Amazon Go grocery concept just kind of further the exclusionary technology surrounding grocery? Now, I don't want to argue one way or another about where technology should go in retail stores. Grocery, though, is a unique sector of retail. Grocery is equal parts public service and for-profit commerce, and we saw Kroger recently, in fact, we talked about it on the show, basically give away real estate from a former store in the Memphis area to another grocer to ensure that there would be no food desert there. However, you see all of these articles out there that came out with the CBS News report about dollar stores creating food deserts, and it was kind of correlation equals causation, which it doesn't in reality, but it made for a lot of clicks and a lot of views. But all of these articles that were critical of the food deserts and critical of these grocers and critical of the dollar stores, they all seem willing to embrace this idea of a store from Amazon that you can literally only shop at if you have the required technology. So we can talk about food deserts all we want, but this is literally a store where they don't let you in the doors unless you have an Amazon account and unless you have a smartphone that you can use to scan your way into the store. So we've talked about the laws in various cities around the world banning cashless outlets. But what about stores that force their customers to have these digital accounts? You would think that that's also exclusionary because we're talking about people that, they're underbanked. Well, if you're underbanked and you only have the capability to pay via cash, you sure as heck aren't going to be able to use this store because, again, it is billing your Amazon account. It is billing the card that you have attached to the Amazon account. So that's where things kind of get interesting with this concept. How far can they actually expand this concept before municipalities, before governments start to say, hey, let's pump the brakes on this a little bit, or even introduce potential laws or regulations stating that they have to allow other customers into the store, which would kind of then erode the sensor-based technology that they've got and the strength there. Warehouse clubs, you might make the argument, well, you can only get into a warehouse club if you have a membership there, but they've always enabled customers to apply for memberships, and those don't require technology or technical literacy. So very interesting if this is something that we will continue to see as far as a development. We talked on the podcast just about a month ago about the continued push towards the app-based discounts at retailers like Kroger, saying like, hey, maybe this is something that people take a look at. Are we excluding populations that maybe aren't technically or technologically literate, whether those are people that maybe don't have a smartphone for one reason or another, whether it's the elderly, whether it's people that can't afford a smartphone or afford the technology. I think it's just something that we have to look at and be cognizant of in grocery. And so that's why this concept from Amazon Go is so worth keeping an eye on, because I'm not so concerned with how the store does. So far, it appears to be doing very well. And, again, high marks to Amazon for what appears to be a very successful rollout so far. My question is, long term, is this something that municipalities, that cities will want in their neighborhoods, or will they fight for more traditional, accessible retailers? So in that regard, it's kind of a combo looking ahead story, but also an actual story regarding that launch, which, again, Amazon appears to have done very well.
We switch gears for our last news story this week. And again, we want to shoot a huge thanks to all of our listeners who have been listening to this podcast for, what, Trent, now? Almost 4 years, over 4 years now. We really appreciate all the feedback from our listeners, whether it's via email or our Twitter account or our Instagram, where you can find us at Retail Podcast. So with that, we move on to lumber liquidators. And despite all the coronavirus fears deflating the market by quite a lot this week, in several days of trading, lumber liquidators exploded by over 20% on Tuesday after their most recent earnings call. You can see we will often say that a company has had a roller coaster last few years, but for no company is this truer than Lumber Liquidators, who has been all over the map after the 60-minute special a few years ago where they talked about formaldehyde. They came into this call with analysts expecting adjusted earnings per share of 15 cents per share against adjusted earnings per share of around 17 cents a year ago. The company has really seesawed in part because of flagging customer sentiment from the formaldehyde issue from that 60-minute special airing, but also a struggle to find their way back into houses of do-it-yourself customers, while strength from contractors has actually given the company several solid quarters since 2016, and they've actually talked about that on the calls that we've covered on this podcast. And earlier this month, this extended into their C-suite. The changes have, at least, as Dennis Knowles resigned as CEO. His role is being filled on an interim basis by Charles Tyson, their former chief customer experience officer, and Nancy Walsh, their current CFO. We heard from both of them on the call, and Nancy Taylor, the chairperson of their board of directors, on the call. And if you look at those earnings numbers real quick, Trent, you can see that earnings per share were very solid against said analyst expectations, driven by increased margin rather than sales. And on an adjusted basis, they absolutely murdered analyst expectations and pretty much left them for dead, coming through with earnings of around 56 cents per share. This, by the way, was actually lower than GAAP earnings per share of 57 cents, in case you are curious about the unadjusted numbers. And that's often interesting to see how those GAAP numbers being higher, of course, than adjusted numbers. Anytime we see that, we really have to applaud their work on the margin front. Still, the sales numbers weren't necessarily anything to write home about. Net sales were up almost $5 million, $4.9 million, 1.8% over the fourth quarter of last year. This was fueled mostly by the opening of new stores, as comps were positive, but only just, increasing 0.4%. So that's below the 1.9% inflation we've been seeing and mentioning. They mentioned vinyl plank as being a big driver here. Remember, we talked about Floor & Decor's massive success in this category on last week's episode. However, they did see some softness in their old calling card, bamboo, as well as laminate flooring categories. Bamboo's interesting, Trent, because a year ago you would think that is what all flooring is going to turn to, but that is not the case. The margin boost was primarily due to accounting practices related to tariffs, by the way, with gross margins expanding over 500 basis points. This really helped them on the earnings per share front, and analysts had this baked into expectations as well, by the way, but not all of the increase on gross margin was due to this accounting change. And you see, it's really about, indeed, they noticed more sales on the higher margin manufactured products front. And you look at vinyl plank and reduced discounting in the stores as a big driver for these margins. They also really continued to increase prices on a few products where possible, where they were seeing adequate demand through a price optimization strategy. Ultimately, while they aren't moving that much on more product, they are being wiser about the products that they do sell and do have in their particular showrooms, allowing them to benefit from greater net margins when all is said and done. And we must give credit to Knowles for this, in part as this was a major focus of his, or at least it seemed to be, over the past few years, and seems to be paying dividends now, certainly, for those earnings per share numbers.
Their margin also saw a pretty big benefit from nearly $60 million being saved off of selling, general, and administrative expenses. This was solely due to them anniversarying $62 million in costs from settlements and legal matters, which we have talked about time and again. It's kind of refreshing from a numbers standpoint to see them finally put the formaldehyde issues behind them from a monetary standpoint, because again, the company had let on that this was going to happen far earlier than what we're actually seeing, but it seems like they are finally cycling past those. Now, because this was their fourth quarter call, we got an outlook for the 2020 fiscal year. However, they made it clear that any projections are difficult because they do source nearly half its product from Asia, mostly from China. And of course, you've got the coronavirus worries that are percolating throughout the industry. Lumber Liquidators did note that in the short term, there's unlikely to be any impact due to product already on hand or in transit, meaning that they've got enough in stock to where it's probably not going to affect them for a little bit. However, they said there is a possibility of an impact potentially for the second quarter and beyond, depending on how long the outbreak persists or how severe it ends up being. They did mention that no one in their offices in China had been affected by it, at least directly being infected by the virus, but at the same time, they said it is affecting their day-to-day lives there as far as ingress and egress of people throughout the country. Still, Lumber Liquidators does expect overall revenue growth to be up low to mid-single digits, with comps in the low single-digit range. They're eyeing 15 new store openings, which should help their overall revenue growth. And this is actually interesting because, Leighton, you and I were just talking a couple of weeks ago about a couple of existing markets where we were talking to Lumber Liquidators folks, and they have maybe one or two stores there that they're looking to expand in those markets. So 15 new store openings, not necessarily a huge number, but also you could see that coming. They finished 2019 with 419 stores, so the increase is a modest build on their current footprint, but not the type of increases that we're seeing from Floor & Decor. We mentioned earlier on regarding the Home Depot story, they're looking to kind of tail back overall chain growth as well. Now, as far as details on the call, Interim President Charles Tyson began the call by talking about the macro environment and noted that Lumber Liquidators currently finds the macro environment to be supportive, and he said that some of the housing metrics they pay particular attention to as a company did turn positive, which in turn they feel like generated demand at Lumber Liquidators. Regarding that continued momentum surrounding vinyl plank, buyers at Lumber Liquidators were out in full force, attempting to broaden their selection to keep pace with other retailers in this space. The benefit for them to continue to build their vinyl plank selection is one part consumer demand, as Leighton talked about, but one part lighter tariff. Something that we mentioned as far as vinyl plank is that it carries larger margins. Part of the reason for this is because there's an exemption to tariffs on vinyl plank and engineered click flooring that are imported from China. And Lumber Liquidators, for their part, they're assuming that that exemption will remain in place for 2020, so they want their buyers to continue to build that selection there, in part because of consumer demand, but also in part because they can get those higher margins on that product. And by increasing their reliance on vinyl plank to drive revenues, you're increasing your margins as you go through. That was the main focus of this call. And not just from Charles Tyson on the call, but basically everyone we heard from on the call, including their CFO Nancy Walsh, said that, hey, our focus is going to be cutting down on expenditures. We're going to keep expenditures in line, maybe tail back some CapEx a little bit, and just become a more efficient company on the revenue we do get. Now, on that note, they haven't ignored hardwood despite a gradual softening of demand in that segment. In fact, in the back half of 2019, they launched a new hardwood line to appeal to customers that are willing to spend a little bit more to get the aesthetics of hardwood. One of the interesting things to come from this call, and they didn't say it explicitly, but there was almost this implicit suggestion of a separation in consumer demand in their space. And this is not something that we necessarily heard from Floor & Decor on their call. Pragmatic consumers wanting a long-lasting floor at a value, those are the consumers that are focusing more on vinyl plank flooring. But Lumber Liquidators is starting to figure out there are customers out there with extra discretionary income who are more concerned about external perception of their floors. And as such, They are opting more and more for those hardwood floors, and Lumber Liquidators is finding it important to make sure that they are keeping new and fresh hardwood lines available for those type of consumers. By the way, that new hardwood line dovetailed nicely with their October yard sale, which is one of the company's 2 major sales events during the course of the year. They said on the call that their October yard sale was fairly successful, although when reading between the lines and during the analyst Q&A, it was easy to see that it wasn't exactly their most successful at driving new consumer interest. Still, much of the focus during the call was on curtailing costs, finding ways around the tariffs, finding alternate solutions, as they've talked about in the past, but more importantly, just increasing the efficiency of the retailer. So it was kind of an interesting call. Wasn't a whole lot there about their plans for the retail stores in general, which is a little bit disappointing. There was a lot on the call about ways in which to increase margins.
As always, we may have a position in or against companies we discuss on the podcast. Do not invest in stocks solely on the input of the podcast hosts.
We've reached the final segment of the Retail Focus podcast, a segment we call Looking Ahead, where H. Layton and I take a look at a story we're keeping an eye on for the next week, month, or year. And we begin with Layton.
So before everybody rolls their eyes at Layton talking about another legacy retailer, I feel as though this really coincides with this week's podcast because we're talking about earnings. We're talking about some transitions with new stores, maybe some closings, not really the closings part up until now, at least, because my looking ahead has to do with JCPenney announcing that they're closing 6 more stores throughout the United States. And this was actually announced on Thursday of this last week. And you see that this coincided with their fourth quarter earnings report. I'll talk about that a little bit, but first I'm going to talk about those closings of those 6 more stores. This is actually in addition to the over 200 stores they've closed in the last 5 years or so. And of course, that includes the couple dozen over the last year and a half that have been announced. But the company has now slightly less than 850 stores in the United States. And if you see, this would bring that number down, of course, by 6. But stores that have been in sort of the C class and B minus class malls have still been struggling. While you see traffic is up, they are not getting sales per transactions up. And you're seeing that as a result, sales comps are down. And so they're looking and they're targeting those stores that are most underperforming in that portfolio of around 850 stores to then close. And they want to exit these spaces that are really being not that productive to their bottom line. So you're seeing that some of these locations, Trent, are in parts of the country that, of course, you would expect that to be. And you can see that all of these 6 stores are going to be in various parts of the country. And we actually don't have word as to exactly where they're going to be, but they are saying that they're looking over their entire portfolio all of the time, basically to see what is most underperforming to really try to have a renewed focus on the stores that can be sustainable for the long term. And that brings me to their surprise fourth quarter profit. So Jill Soltau, the new CEO with the company, has obviously had a massive task. I mean, we talk about a looking ahead story. This is a huge looking ahead story for her because this is really her executive legacy, you could say, because she's been in retail for over 20 years, but this is a huge legacy company that has been hemorrhaging in terms of same-store sales, in terms of earnings per share being down. But this per share net income is really huge for the company. And while it didn't move the stock a whole lot this week because of said coronavirus, which we've touched on about a couple times on this podcast, it's still a huge thing for the company to really have that reinvigorated, that momentum behind you to see that while same-store sales are still continuing to drop, in which they dropped in this most recent fourth quarter by around 7.5%, you're seeing that they can come back to profitability. And they still have, because of that, a lot of liquidity. They almost have $2 billion in liquidity. And that's extremely important because that long-term debt that we always talk about with JCPenney, it still looms large. And yes, they've tried to refinance a lot of that and push that out, but it's still there. It's still there, and it's there by and large because they've been hemorrhaging dollars over the last several quarters. And so to be able to see this fourth quarter profit is huge. In my opinion, does this mean a sustainable turnaround? Does this mean that Jill Soltau's strategies are actually bearing fruit? I think it is still too early to say, but I think there was a lot of positivity on that earnings call. I read through that earnings call. It was very good. They're talking about really trying to reduce inventory in their stores. They're talking about constantly trying to innovate in terms of new merchandise mix. And I think all of those things, again, with a renewed focus on the stores that should be alive in the next 5 to 10 years, will really help the company. And I don't know necessarily what that means for still a large part of their portfolio when you're looking at 200 or 300 stores that are maybe still in questionable areas of the country, questionable malls at least. But regardless, if you can make whatever footprint you do have profitable, I think that's very good for not only the executive team and her legacy, but also very good for the investor that has, Trent, been looking at a stock price that has just plummeted over the past 5 years. We're talking about 5 years ago, the stock traded around $8 a share, over $10 a share at some points, and is now trading at 69 cents per share. And as our longtime listeners would know, that does not make me happy at all to discuss this, because I was a shareholder back from around the middle parts of 2017 and ended up selling at a substantial loss. I bought around $5 a share, sold just above $1 a share, I believe, here recently. And you see that this company really needs a boost like this, and it really needs a strong next fiscal year.
Yeah, it was kind of a very weird earnings call because there's a massive beat on earnings, but still lost 7% in terms of same-store sales and projected comps for next year to be down at around another 3 to 4%. Well, looking from one retailer to the macro level retail landscape for this next year, that's what my looking ahead is focusing on as the NRF released their forecast for retail sales in 2020. They're forecasting retail sales to rise between 3.5 and 4.1%. This increase is in line with some of the better retailers that we've seen. We just finished talking about Home Depot on this show and Lumber Liquidators, and their comps are right around this 3.5 to 4.1% growth. But when you look at added stores for retailers like Lumber Liquidators might come in a little bit higher than that. Obviously, those well-functioning retailers will be offset somewhat by retailers like JCPenney who are expecting sales to drop. Now, Jack Kleinhens, a former Retail Focus podcast guest and NRF's chief economist, said a couple of different things regarding these numbers. One is it's assuming that coronavirus does not become a global pandemic, and I think we are starting to see, it might be too early to tell, and of course we're not in the medical profession, but we're starting to see signs that potentially it could be slowing as it spreads, but also you've got the election year in there potentially affecting some consumer sentiment. So a couple of things to keep an eye on there, but Kleinhens underscored gains in household income and wealth, lower interest rates, and still, despite everything going on, strong consumer confidence at the end of the day. You know, obviously the looking ahead will be, does retail actually attain these particular gains? But moreover, I think, how are these gains spread out across the retail industry? Can those legacy retailers, like the ones Leighton's talking about, can they stem the losses? And how much or to what extent do the general merchandise retailers in particular continue to see growth in their areas? Now, this 3.5 to 4.1%, this far outpaces expected inflation. And we just got word this week that it's potential, at least there's a few news stories out there talking about it, how the Fed is discussing maybe reducing interest rates if coronavirus does worsen the effect on the U.S. economy. So a lot to keep an eye on for this coming year in retail, but I, for one, am excited to see how things break down. Personally, I think it's going to be a good year for general merchandise retailers. I think it's going to be less of a positive year for grocery retailers, but still in the positive. Just looking forward to how sales break down, and ultimately, we know people are going to probably increase their spending within the retail landscape. How are they going to increase retail spending? And that's really the billion-dollar question as far as retail is concerned, or trillion-dollar question, if you will, as far as retail is concerned in the U.S. Well, that'll do it for this week's podcast. For Leighton, I'm Trent saying so long until next week. never questioned my love for retail as I recorded this podcast while my beloved Bournemouth was playing. They managed a 2-2 draw against Chelsea, if you're wondering. We'll be back 7 days from now.
This has been the Retail Focus Podcast. For more, visit our website at retailfocuspodcast.com and subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher. Follow us on Twitter at Retail Podcast.